This is a fact. Okay. Most women worked in, how do I come? So most women worked in jobs that were typical for women. Household chores and education remained largely in the hands of women. So it can be said that equal rights for women were limited to certain areas. In the men-controlled publishing houses, women were limited to the publication for the youngest children, preschool only. Here you see one of these fine and rare exceptions, Bumi, a magazine for preschoolers with a story in a March issue, 1962, so early, about Women's Day. The story presents working mothers in typical female occupations as streetcar drivers, engineers, or the nurses. The working mothers as a normality. By reading and analyzing these comics and their stories, a deeper understanding of life and dictatorship can be given. At least this is my opinion. In the following, I show you how gender and gender relations had been constructed through popular comics. You will see the gap between the high standard in theory and the disappointing reality in East German equality policy. I will give you a selection from East German comics from the 1950s to the 80s with female characters or female readers or created by a woman. And you will see how gender and the socialist policy of equal rights for women were represented or not in the comics. From the end of the Second World War to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we find traditional funny strips for adults in the press. They were not at all different from those published in West Germany or in Germany before 1945. They were old-fashioned flapper strips with jokes about weak men or strong women or vice versa. For children and young adults, comics were published in the GDR from the mid-1950s as a rejection of incoming comic books from the West and as a response to the uprising of June 1953 as well. More pleasure, more fun for the people was the idea. Comics were given space not only in the dailies and weeklies. New magazines for children and young adults were published. Most of them contained comics. Even real comic book magazines were published, Atze and Mosaik von Hannes Hegen. From the beginning, these comics had propaganda purposes. They were controlled by the Communist Party and the Communist Youth Organization. But as you can see in these early examples, in the early years, propaganda was still not very intrusive. Non-political children's adventures were portrayed in which boys and girls always were equal. The friendship with socialist brother countries was celebrated. Progresses on the road to socialism visualized. Here, in our example, East German kids are visiting Warsaw. According to the communist ideology, boys and girls should even develop an image of the enemy, the class enemy. They had to learn to hate. Already in these early comics, children actively fight enemies. In these examples, spies, illegal border crossers, and smugglers. And the children always cooperate with the East German border troops or the police. But there's an exception. Before the Berlin Wall was erected in August 1968, children could cross the border to both sides, and some stories could be set in West Berlin as well. So see the example on the top right. Communist children, communist youngsters are making fun of West Berlin police. All these funny adventures about teens have girls, and the girls team up with the boys. It's very important because that will be changed very, very hard. The most beloved comic magazine was Mosaik von Hannes Hegen, started in 1955. And you should expect that women in the socialist media were not presented as sex objects, but as female personalities achieving remarkable things in history and in the present. But it was obviously more difficult than we would expect. And the magazine Mosaik was very special because Hannes Hegen could control his creation until he in the 1970s lost his fight with the censors and the communist publishers. By the way, for his creative work, he was awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany in 2010. Hegen did also not follow socialist propaganda ideas. Mosaik presents his own generation's ideas about women, influenced by films that he and his draftsmen saw in West Berlin cinemas in the 1950s. So old-fashioned ideas about women had survived. His comics stripped females with stereotypes of their time and obviously not at all socialist personalities. Male fantasy products as these sexist stereotypes of beautiful exotic women or silly wives irritate in a comic magazine for children. The female character Putzi, a young loving wife, is a ridiculous stereotype of a silly helpless woman. And even the science fiction stories, we don't find a changing social status and modern working lives of women. Women are, even on the spaceship, are still cleaning ladies. One character is different, Syria Kisur, a beautiful feminine woman in the headquarters of a spaceship. She is tough, she's independent, but she does not play a bigger role in the story. And later, she marries the captain of the spaceship. In the 1960s, there was a new concept in comics with the political changes in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. And as a result of the anti-comic debate in the 1950s, most comics disappeared from the dailies and weeklies. From now on, comics were set in a more realistic environment, dominated with stories mixing fact and fiction to articulate political messages written and drawn by men. The comics changed from funny to a more serious tone, and in these more realistic, even brutal comics, girls lost their part as a comics heroine. Not to tell you that there were no romantic comics at all in East Germany. In the mid-60s, an explicit requirement for female characters in so-called socialist comics was formulated, but never realized. The main problem, obviously, was that there was not even a handful of female cartoonists or comic writers at that time. The exception of the rule was Christa Altenburger and the cartoonist Gisela Wichmann. Both got a chance to do comics in the Trommel, the weekly for middle school pupils, and only in the 1960s they were active. Christa Altenburger developed stories based on the lives of strong women from the past, especially women who courageously struggled against oppression and defamation. On the left, we see a comic published in Die Trommel. The story depicts the life and work of the German naturalist Amalie Dietrich, who was best known for pioneering work in Australia in the 1860s. On the right, you see a comic by Altenburger and drawn by Gisela Wichmann about the life of Karl Marx. But the focus was actually on Marx's wife, Jenny, how she developed a sense of injustice at the age of 18. And I think it's a good model, a good role model for girls, the best I've seen in the East German comics. But this comics is quite unknown because it was published only in the Communist Party's district paper for Potsdam. As you've seen, the Mosaik von Hannes Hegen was a problem for a socialist publisher. So the publishing house tried to publish an alternative socialist comic magazine, Neues Bilderheft für Jungen und Mädchen, new picture book for boys and girls. This example from 1965 is the fifth magazine in the series. It's about a young woman fighting against the German Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in World War II. Gertrude, a nurse in the Red Army, volunteers to plant a bomb at German headquarters. In there, she is sexually harassed several times in a bad language, some kind of sexual military slang from the German Wehrmacht, and the possibility of rape is implied. Gertrude is successful, the headquarters is blown up, and she survives. But the comic book experiment did not. Teachers and parents protested against it, and selling it at the school was forbidden. I guess it was a modern style, the modern artwork, for that time too modern for the mid-60s. The language was bad and sexual references in comics for children, even a possible rape, was simply unacceptable at that time. In the 1960s and 70s, the life of working class heroes as Karl Liebknecht and Ernst Thälmann, Wilhelm Pieck, and so on were adapted to comics, but this was not the case for women. Today, we may think of famous Marxist philosopher, anti-war activist, and revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg as a good role model, but not in East Germany. She was a socialist icon, but her political views were heavily criticized. Still in the 1970s, radical democratic and anti-militaristic texts were described as errors. Here in the comic magazine Atze, in 1969, she was presented as a leading member of the Spartacus group who gave speeches, was arrested and murdered. Not so much of an interesting role model for girls. In East Germany, working girls and women out to earn a living were a normality. Independent, but perhaps not so adventurous, but nothing of that we will find in the comics. We will find some examples about women's wartime role, some about their part in the reconstruction work in the first years after the Second World War. Here you see a woman as a tractor driver in 1946. The tractor was a friendly gift of the Soviet military government to the East German peasants, and that was the important propaganda part of the story, not the working woman. Really strong women in comics we can find only in stories from outside Europe, women in the third world countries, or in stories telling about the war in Vietnam, popularizing the solidarity with the fighting in Vietnam and an enemy image of the United States. But these girls could not be a real role model for East German girls. The Woman, an illustrated weekly newspaper for women, presented women who have achieved remarkable things. They were elected from all sectors, if only to affirm the idea of unity and love for the system, women as farmers, skilled workers, and scientists. On a kind of a children's side, Friedrich published comics of a high quality from 1978 on until it was lying down. But we don't find female cartoonists or female writers here as well. And obviously, there was even a lack of ideas regarding the portrayal of strong women. Again, we can read about the adventures of Amalie Dietrich and Jenny Marx, and now written by Wolfgang Altenburger, the husband of Christa Altenburger. She disappeared. First, in the 1980s, we find comics about East German political reality. Here one published in Friedrich in 1986. It's Bernd Günther's 4 times, later 5 times Müller. The story is about the Müller family, mother, father, daughter, son, who will have a baby. After the baby is born and 4 heads now become 5, the family has to deal with baby cries, first teeth, full nappies, and other adjustment difficulties. Of course, both parents work. Not only that, they take distance learning courses as well. The children take an active part in news life and help out in the neighborhood. An ideal image of GDR socialism, and without intrusive propaganda. But the end of the German Democratic Republic was near. This is already all I have to say about East Germany. I think one thing, this very short presentation of East German comics and the image of women can demonstrate is that the domination of society by Communist Party, what we in German call Durchherrschung der Gesellschaft, had not succeeded. There was a gap between aspiration and reality, and that gender structures changed very slowly, even in a socialist society. But at least we have had a lot of comics in East Germany, and the situation in the Soviet Union was very different. Actually, we could buy even the socialist papers in Berlin, at least. If you want to read something about the situation in Russia, in Russian comics in English, you can read the book Comic Art in Russia by José Alanis from the University of Washington, Seattle. And he has published several articles about that after 2010 as well. As you see here, the impressive lineage of comics in Russia starts with religious icons and Lubok, the woodblock prints. And in the 20th century, we have the revolutionary era roster windows, a form of propaganda poster, also associated with the name of Vladimir Mayakovsky, instructional diagrams during the Cold War in the line of the American duck and cover, and Soviet children's books and journals. During the Soviet era, comics, even in the sort familiar to Western Europeans, were occasionally appearing in kids' magazines like Muzilka and Veselye Kartinki. But suspicions to the comics medium about its allegedly negative effects on the children survived for many years. For me, a little bit astonishing if you look at Ivan Semyonov's comic Petya Ryshik, the Russian Tang-Tang, published in Veselye Kartinki in the 1950s and 60s, with at least a circulation of over 5 million. in the late 60s in several collected volumes. Petrushin made friends in America and Africa, and the comic developed even a clear image of the enemy, the white racist policeman in the United States, and the foreign, that means the Western military all over the world. Russian comics first broke vital new ground under Boris Yeltsin, with the emergence of comics for an explicitly non-child audience. Both comics and readership changed. Fan activism has given the Russian comics culture a more international history by exhibiting first and now even publishing Serbian comics by Russian artists from the 1930s. Actually, several of these comics were published in Sweden during the Second World War in journals like Veckans Serie or Hemmets Journal. Since the rise of Putin, the industry is characterized by its abundance of subjects, genres, and formats. Major comic festivals were held, Komissia in Moscow, Boomfest St. Petersburg, and Western publications had a breakthrough. Since 2010, comic centers arise, as well as comic sections in bookstores and libraries, even real comic shops, and comic clubs attached to libraries with interest in mainstream as well as alternative comics. Now there is a stronger domestic competition against foreign licensed products. A sustainable comics industry has developed, and the comics reader in Russia today has an extraordinary array of choices, from the US mainstream flush of Bubble to the indie pleasures of Space Cow and everything in between. Russia's political climate might complicate an alternative comic publisher's business model, especially for controversial content, but some of these has achieved success in comics industries abroad. We can say Russian comics had become a transnational phenomenon. And even if Julia Alekseyeva's graphic novel is part of an American publishing and still not of the Russian publishing sphere, her novel can be seen as part of this transnational phenomenon. I'm glad you're here, Julia, and I loved your graphic novel, and I think the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and I learned so much about GDR and Russian comics, so thank you so much for that wonderful lecture. Great, so I am going to have a little PowerPoint. Let me make sure, can everyone see that? Okay.
Yes.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned also Mayakovsky in your talk as well. See a little bit of Mayakovsky from in my book as well. So let me see. Okay. So do you see the cover, the title, the cover of the book? Okay, wonderful. So I just wanted to give a kind of brief overview of the book, and then since we have this Zoom format, it is actually one of the few things it's actually good for is reading comics like aloud with the imagery behind it. So I'll read about a chapter and a half from the book, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of my more recent work. So this book came out in 2017, and it's a nonfiction graphic narrative. You could call it a graphic novel, call it a graphic memoir. I think the word graphic novel and the word comics they're really the same thing. And so I think in the American publishing industry, graphic novel is often used as a way to sell comics to people that otherwise might not want to read them. So generally, I don't see any kind of difference between graphic novels and comics. But so the book is based on the memoirs that my great-grandmother wrote secretly before she died in the United States about her life in the former Soviet Union. So this is the kind of inside of the cover of the book, but it's a kind of a collage of different scenes from the book. My great-grandmother had a very, very fascinating, interesting life. She was 100 years old when she died. So she was born in 1910 and died in 2010. So her life really spans the entirety of the life of the former Soviet Union, a little bit before, a little bit after. And she saw with her own eyes everything that happened and was a real participant in a lot of the events that transpired there. She had a unique experience, of course, being a woman and also being a Jewish woman. So a minority in the former Soviet Union, and obviously a lot of really terrible things were happening to Jews, but also interestingly, because she was Jewish, she in the early years of the former Soviet Union had far more rights than Jews had ever had previously. So you see in kind of the history of the Soviet Union how important Jewish people were in the early years of the Soviet Union with regard to art and culture and government and in the Bolshevik Revolution. And then that kind of, obviously starts being a little bit more complicated during the years of Stalin. And in her memoirs that she wrote secretly, she talked about seeing the revolution when she was a young child, the pogroms that were happening in around Kiev and various parts of the Soviet Union at the time, and then these kind of flourishing, fascinating artistic years of the 1920s, and the rise of Stalin and the oppression and purges of 1937, and then a few years of reprieve, and then World War II, where all of her family who are able to fight or become part of the Red Army fighting the Nazis, and a lot of her family, as you could probably expect, ends up perishing during World War II. So she was writing all of these things about her life, and she actually ended up becoming a lieutenant in the Red Army. Because she knew both Russian and Ukrainian, she became a typist and then secretary for the NKVD, which ended up later, of course, becoming the KGB. And she saw and understood, I think, a lot more than the average person from the Soviet Union about what was going on at the time. So she certainly had a very colorful and interesting life. And I actually knew her very, very well. We lived together when my family emigrated in 1982. When I was 4 years old, and we were actually always very, very, very close, even though we were about 80 years apart. There was something that really tied us together. And so after she passed away in 2010, I thought that this kind of close connection and similarity that I always saw between us, between the millennials and what is considered the Great Generation, I saw a lot of really interesting ties between our generations that I didn't necessarily see in my parents' and grandparents' generation. So I wanted to kind of think about how our lives were kind of entangled in a variety of different ways. And a lot of the book was also kind of coming to terms with being from a country that no longer exists, and the kind of separation felt from what is happening now in Eastern Europe versus what we grew up with in the former Soviet Union. So the book is about 80% from my great grandmother's perspective. She wrote in Russian. I wrote this book in English, but I tried to translate it as close to possible to the original language. And obviously the imagery is my own. And I'll talk a little bit about how I found kind of imagery to work from. But about like less than 20% of the book is actually from my perspective. And between every chapter of the book, which is about her life, there's a small section, I call them interludes, like music style interludes, where I have just a few pages about kind of my own story and like my experiences as an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, my experiences kind of coming to terms with both my kind of Sovietness, Ukrainianness, Russianness, and importantly Jewishness. So kind of coming to terms with what that means in a variety of different societies, and seeing how kind of my kind of burgeoning political activism as a teenager and young adult kind of collided with my great-grandmother's kind of experiences in the Soviet Union. And she was actually always a communist, always a believer in communism, despite all of the kind of horrific things that happened. And I found that very inspiring. So I have these interludes to kind of show my connection to my great-grandmother, how our stories are kind of intertwined, and how one thinks of that generation and of this experience of being from a culture and country that no longer really exists in the world. So this page kind of gives you a sense of how my process of drawing. So I had a lot of different processes when it came to each page. I first kind of sketched it out, and then I created the hand painted. It's using like an ink wash technique, so it's really just ink and water, various iterations of ink and water, all across the book. And I used a variety of different reference imagery for it. This is a page that kind of shows where I received the kind of visual aids, like for various parts of the book. I obviously try to find every single photograph that my family had of my great grandmother and of people in her life, and so a lot of the imagery that I have of my great grandmother in the book is really straight from the photographs that we have. And one of the reasons that I ended up choosing the technique I did for the artwork is because I wanted it to feel like a photograph that was like in the middle of decay. Like I wanted it to feel like you are looking at a photograph that is crinkled and imperfect, you know, but it's not digital, you know, it's something that is that has this extreme nostalgia, you know, that is associated with it. So that's the kind of emotional feeling that I wanted people to get out of reading the book, because for me, what I really wanted people to get out of reading the book was a feeling of what it was like to really live in the Soviet Union, not a historical account or an analytical account, but a real affective and intuitive feeling about what it was like to actually exist in that period. So I used a lot of photographs. I used a lot of even things like figuring out what did people wear, what type of coat that they have at that particular year. I looked to as many photo albums as I could find, and spend a lot of time in the library looking at archives in terms of just visual archives, because that was for me more important than and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the real feeling, right, of living in the former Soviet Union is what I wanted people to get out of it. So every page that you see in the book actually probably has around 10 to 15 source images that I've kind of looked at to try to figure out what the buildings looked like, what the clothing looked like, what my great grandmother looked like, what her friends perhaps looked like, and every page just has so many different kind of source images and reference materials that I was looking at. So I just wanted to take some time to read just about a chapter and a half, almost 2 chapters. This comes from kind of early in the book because I don't want to give anything away. And so I'll just kind of read them aloud, and sometimes might do voices for the different characters. So, just be warned about that. And so, yeah, this comes from chapter 3, 1920 to 1925. So she was around 10 years old at the start of this chapter and 15 at the end of it. The dialogue was created by me. I just kind of imagined it, but everything that is from the voice of my great grandmother really is as close as possible to the original Russian as I could get without it sounding strange in English. So yeah, that was not created by me in terms of the writing. I don't really remember when exactly the burden of the family fell on my shoulders. I was around 10. My mother was often sick, and as I was the eldest girl, I became head of the household. We had an enormous family. Every other year, someone new was born into the world. By 1920, these were all of my siblings. Vladimir or Vova, 13, Solomon or Senya, 8, Vanya, 6, Yuva, 4, Sima, 2, and David, not yet born. I had to take care of everyone, and somehow I pulled it off. I took care of the babies, especially when David was born, took the kids on walks outside, fed, clothed, and bathed them, helped my mother, cleaned the apartment, which had to be spotless. I remember sitting outside in the courtyard on a pile of sand and cleaning the samovar, bowls, and candlesticks until they gleamed like gold. When my siblings became old enough, they went to school, Lyubov, Fenya, and Sima to a Jewish school, and the boys and I to a Russian one. This was from 1918 to 1921, although you could barely even call it school, when all around there were gangs, famine, illness, and coal. After 4th grade, I was forced to stop going to school. I just couldn't anymore with all the work around the house. And I'll just say very briefly that she never actually had time to go back to school, so she had a 4th grade education, but was such a voracious reader, even in her very, very old age. So really, truly a self-taught person. All right, I'll go back to the text now. We didn't have any books, but Wova would bring me back some from his school, which I would read in secret under the bed at night. There was no other time to do it, but I'd read everything and anything. I'd read until late at night, until the early morning hours. My parents decided that I needed to learn a trade in order to help the family make a bit of money, so I was taught to sew. My mother would buy cheap cotton, and I'd cut it up and begin sewing. This was how I sewed dresses for Yuba, Fenya, and Sima. I designed dresses based on my own whim and fancy, and shirts for Vova and Senya. When anyone went out of the house, especially during the winter, it was every man for himself. The entire family had to share one pair of boots. Whoever grabbed them first got to leave the house. Beat it, Senya, I got here first. Not fair, you got to go out yesterday. Once, my mother found a pair of galoshes during the coldest days of the year, but it was so slippery that I could barely walk. They were of no use in the heat of winter. I wasn't a very good seamstress, but I was efficient. In one day, I could sew 2 dresses, clean the house, and read or go out with friends in the evenings. Although I really did wish I could have gone to school with the rest of my siblings. Vova, however, was a big help. Hey Lola, I brought you back some school books, today's Pravda, and something a little more exciting. I started going to a youth club not far from school. There's tons of great reading material there and free classes. I picked this up for you. We've all been reading it in the club, and I think you'll like it. He taught me a lot in those years. So now we're jumping to 1925 to 1930. So this is in her teenage years, kind of 15 to 20. In the summer of 1925, I was sent to Dnipropetrovsk to learn how to sew for my cousin Lyuba. Your cousin could teach you a lot, and you could help her with the wedding. But I don't want to go. I'm fine here. So I measure here and cut here? Uh-huh. You don't mind helping around the house a bit, do you, Lola? No, it's fine. Lyuba was a good seamstress, but I barely had time for sewing lessons. During the day, I cleaned, mopped floors, went grocery shopping, did laundry. Really, I became a housekeeper for my very own cousin. Okay, remember, vegetables for soup, and now bread. But I quickly made friends, and in my free time, which almost never existed, we played sports and exercised. It was the summer after all, and jogged in the stadium. I wasn't too bad at the 100-meter sprint. That same summer in 1926, I was sent to the wedding of a close relative. It was a grand affair lasting 3 whole weeks in the Jewish tradition. A 20-year-old family friend named Isaac fell in love with me during these 3 weeks. Everyone wanted to set us up. You know, Isaac has expressed interest in marrying you. Oh, what a lovely idea! But the wind just didn't push me in that direction. Sorry, Auntie, I have absolutely no desire for a husband right now. And besides, I have friends. In 1927, I worked for our new landlord, Ratmansky. He was a bourgeois before the war, but made himself into an artisan to avoid persecution. So I became a machinist at his stamp-making factory. 2 of my male friends worked at the factory illegally. They got 60 rubles per week while I was paid 20 rubles because I was a girl. In the legal Soviet workplace, men and women were generally paid the same amount. But money was money, and everything cost only a few kopecks at the time. In 1927, I was admitted into the Profsoyuz and joined a metallurgy club with my brothers Solomon and Vladimir. The Profsoyuz is the Soviet trade union. We weren't metallurgists, of course, but the club had dances, readings, films. Some of the best days of my life were spent in that club, where I learned so much and even starred in the operettas. It was there that I met my first husband, Mitya. Hey, Lola, so you entered the scene from, is that your boyfriend? Oh, hi, Mitya. The boys and I are going hiking in the country this weekend. You should come with us. Sure, that sounds fun. Mitya was friends with a cavalry squadron. We were surrounded by the military and often accompanied them on paramilitary campaigns. We learned to shoot rifles and went hiking up and down the Dnieper River. Hey, lovebirds, time to head out. With rifles slung over our shoulders and carrying gas masks, we boated over to Trokhanyev Island. We stayed there for 2 days, hiking and practicing at the shooting range. There were 100 of us, 94 boys and only 6 girls. Nice shot, Mitya. In 1929, the stamp-making factory was shut down and I was left without a job, so the Labor Committee sent me to work in the Kiev Arsenal factory. In 1930, I was accepted into the Komsomol, where my brother Vladimir was already a second secretary. Congratulations, Lola. You've been a great worker, a model citizen. You've been recommended for the Komsomol. All in favor? Aye. I was overjoyed. After all, I'd wanted to get into the Komsomol ever since I was 15, but my father forbid it, since there was so much work to do around the house. Being in the Komsomol was completely incredible. I was charged with many tasks that I wholeheartedly enjoyed, like being a Komsomol leader for the blind. I helped them navigate the city streets. They'd learned to recognize the sound of my footsteps as we walked, and this way they never got lost. I also acted in plays at the Komsomol's drama club and continued to do this until I got permanent work. And there were other exciting events too. Wow, Mayakovsky is coming next week to recite poetry. We can sign up to see him. Sign me up, Vova, sign me up too. All right, everyone, sit down. He's about to start. And so this next page that I'll show, where is it? Is just a poem by Mayakovsky, but I wanted to read it out loud just because I love it so much. Let me try and move this. Okay. Die then, my verse, die like a common soldier, like our men who nameless died attacking. I don't care a spit for tons of bronze, I don't care a spit for slimy marble, where men of kind will come to terms about our fame. Let our common monument be socialism built in battle. Men of posterity examine the flotsam of dictionaries. Out of Lethe will bop up the debris of such words as prostitution, tuberculosis, blockade. For you who are now healthy and agile, the poet with the rough tongue of his posters has licked away the consumptive spittle. With the tale of my years behind me, I begin to resemble those monsters, excavated dinosaurs. Comrade life, let us march faster through what's left of the 5-year plan. My verse has brought me no rubles to spare. No craftsmen have made mahogany chairs for my house. In all conscience, I need nothing except a freshly laundered shirt. When I appear before the CCC of the coming bright years by way of my Bolshevik party card, I'll raise above the heads of a gang of self-seeking poets and rogues all the 100 volumes of my communist committed books. So the reason Mayakovsky figures here, even though I have really no idea where my great grandmother would have seen Mayakovsky, he did do a lot of performances and readings of his poems in Kiev, and I'm sure she did see him at some point, but she was really obsessed with Mayakovsky. And actually when, and I am too, so I guess we have that in common, but my great-grandmother actually titled her memoirs, and when I say memoirs, she didn't publish them, obviously they were secret, and she wrote them on loose leaf sheets of paper, but the folder that she kind of kept all of these papers in was titled Of Time and of Myself, of Времени и о себе, which is a verse by Mayakovsky. So even like the very idea of her writing her memoirs was actually so connected to Mayakovsky's poetry. And so I'm going to jump ahead in time and just say read one of the interludes in one of the middle sections. So this is from my voice rather than my great-grandmother's voice. And this is a little bit later in the book. So Interlude 2008 to 2014. I always felt a strong generational distance from my mother, who was prudent, introverted, and conservative. I felt an almost equal generational divide from my grandmother Tanya, who was lively but generally very cautious. My mother and grandmother followed rules. They did as they were told. They only had 1 or 2 serious relationships. My mother thought I was absolutely crazy. I grew up feeling like a completely different breed of human. How could I explain my desire for something other than what there was? Music, art, film, politics, books. These things restored a sense of wonder in the world that I thought my parents lacked. Happiness wasn't quiet and calm, a few close friends, a comfortable job. It was the unknown and exciting, enormous parties, passionate and ill-fated love affairs, spontaneous trips to far corners of the world. It is said that Lola's generation, called the GI generation, is closest to Generation Y or millennials in sentiment and personality. Nowhere was this more evident than in my 4-generation family. Of course, I didn't know this at the time Lola was alive. It was just a feeling of closeness, something that bonded the two of us more than other members of the family. An idealism, maybe, a desire for something, anything out of the ordinary. So that's all I'll do in terms of reading, because I don't want to give anything away, but after this sort of Stalinism comes in and it gets exciting and scary. I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the other work that I've done since then, which also relate to some way to some of the themes of this symposium and to some of the, obviously the themes from Soviet Daughter, but what I've been doing since 2017 is really trying to find a way to merge kind of academic kind of analyses and thinking about things that are also things that I teach and study and research as a scholar of media and film and visual culture, with the graphic narrative style and with the graphic narrative genre. So the first thing that I did after the book came out and after taking like a bit of time to really think about what I want to do next is this short piece about Walter Benjamin, actually, and about the looking at several different books that had been coming out about Benjamin and thinking about how important Benjamin was to art and visual culture in the study of film. What I started doing is kind of using a more kind of colorful watercolor style combined with ink that kind of is similar to some of the style that I was using in Soviet Daughter, but more kind of adventurous, I think, a little bit. I think I became a little bit more confident with my kind of ability in comics. And so this came out in the Paper Brigade in 2018. I did a funny comic trying to explain to Americans, and especially the American Jewish community, why Soviet Jews have Christmas trees, and why they're not called Christmas trees, they're New Year's trees. And so this was a bit of like a historical cultural explainer, because I was just so sick of trying to convince people why it's okay that I have a Christmas tree, even though I'm not Christian. That this was kind of a more of one-off comic for Lilith in 2017. I then, because I'm also very interested in film, and actually there are some references to Vertov and Dziga Vertov's films in the book that are kind of in Soviet Daughter that I put in as almost like a little Easter egg. I did a short comic about Dziga Vertov, who I actually, a lot of my dissertation is connected to the films of Dziga Vertov, so I was trying to find ways of combining what I was researching in my graduate program and in my the courses I was teaching after I received my PhD with my kind of interest in comics. There are a lot of reasons why I decided to continue doing this with comics, but I thought the comics really allowed for a wider range of readers than necessarily just academic discourse. And especially because so much of the work I do is about film, it felt natural for me to try to combine visual analysis and film analysis with comics, because then you have already the visual medium, and it felt like a very natural fit. So I also feel a lot of kinship with Dziga Vertov, since we're both also Soviet Jews from Ukraine. So I felt like a lot of connection to Dziga Vertov, and I absolutely adore his films. Next, I created a comic for the Nib about 1968, and this was during the 50th anniversary of 1968, and so I was kind of trying to think through the ways that 1968 really showed itself all over the world, in places like Prague and Czechoslovakia, and in Japan, and in Paris, obviously, and the United States. And so trying to find these cross-cultural connections. And this comic, perhaps more than any others, is very tied to my my academic research. So as the older I get, the more I'm really trying to combine the academic and artistic kind of aspects of my work. And then I had a comic in Jewish Currents. Also, you'll find a lot of things that are connected to Jewish Currents. They've been probably the best way to get my work out there. They're a leftist publication based in the United States that are Jewish, but thinking about Jewishness as connected to leftism and connected to kind of progressive and left-wing thought all across the board. And so they've been extremely important to me personally. So this was a comic that was about the town Vitebsk, which was traditionally a Jewish village that you probably have heard of, and thinking about Marc Chagall's work. But I was looking at the early years of the Soviet Union as this beautiful, fascinating kind of outburst of creativity in this town, and the connection between, and the rivalry between Marc Chagall and Malevich, and also the connection between the town and El Lissitzky, and how this town became a kind of a breeding ground of so many different artistic techniques, but also that it was so short-lived. And I found that there were so many connections between what my great-grandmother was describing about the 1920s, and this fascinating city where there was art everywhere, all over the place. And yeah, I just thought it was like such a fascinating place. I then created a comic for World Literature Today about Viktor Scholowsky. So yet another figure from the late teens and early 1920s from the former Soviet Union, a formalist literary critic. And so you have here also, of course, Lev Trotsky, and one of my most important figures in my academic career, which is Svetlana Boym, who has since passed away. But trying to figure out what about Scholowsky's work I found so fascinating, so important. And I've actually heard that now many people are actually in the US using my comic to try to explain Scholowsky's work to undergraduate students. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And I love that it has this kind of life outside of the publication in World Literature Today. And then I created a work for Sequentials, which is actually a academic online publisher about it's almost a bit of a manifesto about why I think this type of style, these sort of shorter academic, I call them graphic essays, are useful and important within and outside of academia. You have Art Spiegelman here, and I'm kind of thinking about my own work and where to go next. And then this is the most recent comic I've done, or at least that has already been published. So this is from Jewish Currents again from this past summer, and I was reflecting on the George Floyd protests, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and thinking about the idea of violence and how violence, we think of violence as always necessarily physical, or but actually that the communities that have experienced violence aren't necessarily physical violence, but a kind of the horrors of gentrification and of constant surveillance by police. And I was really thinking about the ways in which something like graffiti, that you saw all over the place in the US in June of 2020. And the graffiti on this page, for instance, I photographed, or one of my neighbors photographed around our house. I've actually found it really beautiful because the graffiti was a manifestation of this extreme anger from violence that was laid dormant but existed for hundreds and hundreds, 400 years in the United States. So I was thinking through different forms of violence and trying to connect the work I was doing with thinking about the 1960s and what was happening in Paris, what was happening in Japan, with an analysis of what was happening in the United States. So I found that to be very gratifying, and I hope to be able to do more kind of graphic essays like that in the future. So I think that's all I have. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. And I guess I'm happy to answer any questions, and if there's any, I also just want to say that this is the first time that have really thought of myself as like a transnational Russian or Soviet or Ukrainian Jewish like artist. So I actually find that to be really fascinating, because I think I find the work of someone like Victoria Lomosko, who is a contemporary Russian cartoonist, very engaged with similar issues. So yeah, thank you for that kind of overview and connection, because it's not something I normally think about. So thanks again.
Okay, thank you so much for this interesting speech and talk about your book and so on. And so thank you, Julia, and also thank you, Michael. So now let's open the floor. Please, either just raise your hand or you will write something in the chat. So please, or well, perhaps you also have some comments for Michael, or Michael have some comments for Julia.
At least I have to ask about comics. What comics did you read before? It's a very strong history, I think. It's a very good and strong graphic novel, and it was your first, I guess. And so I wanted to know what comics did you read? You have Colin Hobbes, you have in the Soviet Daughter, but are there any other Art Spiegelman or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I loved comics growing up, but I did not know that there were any Soviet or Russian comics until I was around 20. And actually, so growing up, I obviously loved Calvin and Hobbes. I would, I would get the newspaper every day and just rip out the comic section and just read that, like. And if I couldn't find a newspaper, I would beg someone in my family to find the newspaper just so I can read the comic section. So a lot of the syndicated, comics that were, I remember I loved the Boondocks, which is definitely a more recent, like leftist comic made by, with a lot of references to the Black Panthers, and it was very, very interesting. I loved it. I didn't even know it was that political at the time that I was reading it, but when I was a teenager, I started reading, quote unquote graphic novels, serious graphic novels, obviously Art Spiegelman, Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. I read a lot of Japanese comics and manga, although probably much more important for me were American comics, but stylistically, I actually found manga, especially manga for girls or shoujo manga, very, very important. Not in terms of the face, shape or anything like that, because it's very stylized, but how the pages kind of spread over two pages. There had a lot more experimental layouts than American comics, and I tried to emulate a little bit more of a fluid panel structure. Like I didn't just want a bunch of boxes. I wanted it to be a lot more fluid and emotional. And shoujo or kind of comics for young girls in Japan were very much about like emotion, and emotional experience and romance. And so I thought that kind of more fluid, panel structure was something that I wanted to emulate. But I also, when I turned 21, I started working as an intern for the Art Institute of Chicago as a translator and kind of coordinator of their exhibit called Windows on the War, which was about what are called task windows, which were the World War II version of Mayakovsky's Rasta windows. So they were these basically giant comics. They were like posters with image and text, and in this beautiful hand-painted style, and were used as propaganda against the Nazis. And they would have these beautiful, gorgeous, sometimes they were satires of Hitler, like Hitler as like a spider, Hitler as like an evil octopus, and Hitler as like an ugly pig. And sometimes they were extremely romantic and tender and difficult and kind of terrifying scenes of World War II, but always with a, we'll beat the fascists kind of definitely anti-fascist vibe to them, and sometimes they were more kind of classic socialist realism, where it's, you know, strong women workers with like a red headscarf, and they have like a rifle in their hands or a bayonet, and they're like ready to fight. So I was so inspired by I still have like photographs that I took of all of these beautiful, you know, task windows that I saw while working on this exhibit, and a lot of the imagery from the book ended up being very kind of inspired by a lot of the imagery from the task windows. So I loved the task windows. So if you're interested, I would definitely look them up. And they were comics, even though they didn't call them that, because each one had an image and then a poem, usually, that was a kind of illustrating what was happening. And they would make, you know, hundreds of these and would send them all over the like the Eastern Front. They would just, you know, drop them out of airplanes and send them to various parts of the Soviet Union to kind of lift up spirits. And yeah, I just think they were so great. But I would read every comic that I could find. But on the Russian side, that was what I was definitely inspired by. Great question. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have a question. I was wondering a little bit how you, if you have any reflections regarding how the image of the woman, the Russian woman, the Ukrainian woman, or the Soviet woman from post-Soviet woman, if it has changed, if you look at Russian media or comics, or yeah, sort of wherever you can find images of women.
Yeah, I definitely think it has changed. I think I don't know a lot about the images of women in the very recent contemporary history, just because I've been in the United States for so long. But even in the Soviet Union, and even in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union, there were different conceptions of women, even between generations of Soviet people. So one of the reasons that I got along so well with my great-grandmother and wanted to devote this book entirely to her was because I found her generation to actually be a lot more feminist, even though she never ever used that word. I don't think she even said it once in her life, but she absolutely was. There was a lot actually more sexual freedom in the era when she was growing up than when my mother and grandmother were growing up. So in the book, I talk about how she, you know, like people would get married and divorced like that. You know, it was not a question or problem. It was like 5 kopecks to get married or divorced. So it was just like people would have affairs. They would, you know, there were people basically, even before polyamory was a thing that is now, you know, very, very common or frequent, that kind of sexual freedom was discussed in connection to political emancipation during the immediate, you know, Bolshevik Revolution era until the time of Stalin. So like she actually grew up with like a spectacular amount of sexual freedom, and, you know, had abortions. You know, it wasn't necessarily officially accepted, you know, but then you have a kind of reverse course, and there, with the advent of Stalinism, you have kind of less and less kind of feminist ideology, you know, in the Soviet Union. So actually, I was in this funny position because I think it was a little bit different in the United States, but where my grandmother and mother were actually far more conservative than my great-grandmother. You know, I think we have this idea in the United States where the older someone is, the more conservative they are. But in fact, it was quite different in the Soviet Union, where it was really generational. And my great-grandmother was always very, I guess, masculine isn't quite the right word, but she did have a kind of masculine kind of personality. She was not particularly emotional, and she's kind of stoic and very kind of, she was like a war woman. You know, there was like a way of thinking about women from that era who fought during the war, who were like the war type woman. And you see this also in films with, say, for instance, Larisa Shepyutko's Wings from 1966, where you have these images of women as like kind of a masculine and a kind of unemotional, not unemotional, but like proud, and who tended to do a lot of work that is normally coded as masculine in other countries, but were more accepted during that era. But then in people that were growing up in the 1960s, like the baby boomer era of Soviet culture, they were so influenced by the West, and then they started having a lot more kind of a more kind of typically, stereotypically feminine kind of personality. And so it became, I think, a little bit less popular, or I guess less accepted for women to take over classically masculine roles. And Stalin had this kind of propaganda about the nuclear family that was really kind of sequestering the woman within the household. So the official state propaganda was obviously that women were equal to men, and that women were engineers, and that women were doing all these great things, and that women were working, like in the comics that Michael, you were talking about. But then in the home, there was actually an increased conservatism with regard to what women were supposed to do. So women were supposed to go to work and be engineers, but they were also supposed to do all the cooking and all the cleaning and all the child rearing. And that was something that really was increased in the late 1940s and 1950s. But that's not how my great grandmother grew up. So that's where you had this like generational divide. Now, I think really it depends on, there are so many different types of subcultures in Russia and Ukraine. And I feel like on one hand, there's a lot of really fascinating and experimental and avant-garde art that's happening in Kiev, and it's happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But also that there is, in terms of familial life, a conservatism that I think continues to exist. So I don't necessarily think it's all great now. I think obviously there's a lot of difficult political situations, and it's not, while there's this great city life and culture, it does tend to be pretty conservative, I think, especially if you leave kind of in a more academic and more kind of subcultural young space. It is pretty conservative, and it's quite religious too, Christian. So that is something that I did not grow up with. So when I encounter it, I feel very separated from that kind of culture. Yeah. But it's a complex question. It's really generationally based. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think Leo has a question.
Aha, I didn't see. Okay, Leo, go ahead, please.
Oh, I think you're muted. I think you have to unmute.
Oh, sorry. I will have to find you.
Yeah, it's now. I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. First and foremost, thank you, Julia, about this very fascinating presentation. This very fascinating combination of philosophical thinking and comics and social analysis and all this, and this, the story of a long life in Soviet and after it. Yes. My question is not maybe in the thematics, but first also I would like to say on Mayakovsky, because he's a really strange and strong figure, and because we traveled to Novokuznetsk a couple of years ago, and this is a town which he was writing a poem, Kuznetsk, the builders of Kuznetsk, something like that, and this parts of poem, they are on the roofs of the central square of the city by the railway station, and this just it's very impressive, because how a poet can get his text on this such a place. So somehow the relation between poetry and life there is very special. But then I would like to ask about the comics in Soviet time. If Michael or you maybe could give some information about it, how it was, and especially was it, I understood there was not very much comics in Soviet, but was there this underground comics and how the censorship was working with it? Was it similar problem as with all literature, or was it somehow separated, or was it undeveloped, or maybe there are different phases also in history that maybe, yeah. So maybe you can give some more information about this question. Thank you.
Michael, do you want to field that first, or because I'm less familiar with the kind of the history of comics in the Soviet Union, but I do feel like it's, to me, well, especially the Jose Alanis's book on Soviet comics and Russian comics is really enlightening. So it's been a while since I read it, but I found it to be extremely useful. And one of the things that I kind of noticed is that most people from the former Soviet Union will claim that there were not very many comics, but there were actually things that would classify as comics, but they weren't called comics. So, for instance, like children's book illustration was incredibly, like, it was very experimental actually, and there were a lot of overlaps between kind of children's literature and animation. And as probably some of you know here, like animation in the Soviet Union was like incredibly gorgeous and very experimental, and was very influential actually for animation in places like Japan. So Ghibli and Miyazaki were super influenced by Soviet animation, because Soviet animated films would be distributed through Communist Party trade agreements. And so if you're a leftist in another country, you'd probably watch Soviet children's animation. But there was a lot of overlap between animation and comics, and there were often like printed versions of kind of book versions of animated films, and children's books that one could consider comics, but the word comics, it was like a loan word from English, so it wasn't like familiar to, I think, most people. So I think part of that has to do with, you know, not respecting, you know, children's literature as actual literature, but also because it was a lot easier to write and draw things that were a little bit more subversive if they were meant for children. So there was an increased number of people that were doing like writing and drawing and animating for children's media and literature in order to avoid censorship from like the government. So I think there is actually a really interesting history to be looked at, and I don't know how many people have looked at it, but there is really it really worked, like avoiding censorship through children's, you know, literature and film. So I think that era was, especially during the thaw period and Brezhnev, was very rich. But again, they don't call it like comics. Yeah, so I guess it would depend on what was called what. Yeah, maybe only very recently are like, you know, are in former Soviet countries, the word comics is discussed, but it was still happening. It was just not classically in a you know, Western oriented tradition. So Michael probably has a lot more to say about this question. But thank you also for the Mayakovsky note. So much of why I'm interested in the 20s in the Soviet Union is this kind of lack of barrier between art and life that I found to be like really fascinating. So, and that's obviously something that Mayakovsky cared about a lot. So.
Yes, of course, Julia's quite right. I think it's cartoons is for the adults and comics are for the children, and the comics doesn't matter. Literature for children doesn't matter. And another thing is that Lenin was aware of the meaning of propaganda, and he had a problem with paper. I think they couldn't have such presses. They couldn't produce comic books in 1 million print runs. And there's a film, and there's an animation film, and there's a documentary film, and so. And then you have the dia film. You have films with 20, 30 pictures, and they were actually something of animation, something of a comic strip, and you can have this film for a whole school. One film for a whole school. I think this is something of economic idea there, that they didn't have comics. And then the other thing, comics when they started up in the socialist countries with the comics. I told you East Germany in 1955, Julia Kartinki in the Soviet Union in 1956. And there was in Bulgaria, in the Baltic countries, all the same. They have this new Julia Kartinki, papers, journals with a lot of pictures, with Disney pictures and all the stuff. At the very first beginning in the 1950s. And then we have the anti-comic debate starting in the USA, 1952, 55, but it survived in the socialist countries as an anti-American debate. And so the teacher said, okay, but what's the difference between these comics here? We have those comics, it's shit, you can't have it. And that's why they took it back. In the 1960, it was, they disappeared. In East Germany, it disappeared. And if you look at the Julia Kartinki, you see there are a lot of pictures in the 1950s, perhaps print run 250,000. And there are a lot of text in the 1970, print run 5 million. There's a difference in that case. And I think that you can see different other things. What about underground? I think underground was not, if you look at the East German underground situation, it's developing in the late 1980s. As you see in 1988 and something like that. I think it's the same in the Soviet Union, and there's an explosion in the 1990s. In 2000, this was Alan is writing about. It's mostly looking at these underground. These things are happening there for adults and not for children. And he doesn't, this is a problem perhaps in Alan's book, he doesn't look at the children's comics as well.
Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you. Any other question or comment?
One question, just a reaction to Soviet daughter. You're telling us stories, sad stories about Ukrainian nationalists, not so good people, worse than the communists. You're telling about the Chechen people murdering all the Jewish people. How was the reactions about these topics?
Yeah, I actually did not, I'm glad that I did not receive any pushback from Ukrainian people. Actually, I went to Ukraine. It's a long story, but I tried to get the first Ukrainian publication of the book, but it didn't work out because of contract problems. But I was really worried going into Ukraine because I know that there were, there was a kind of a burgeoning nationalist movement. Thankfully, now it's a little bit more subsided and things are looking a little bit better. But I did have these pages in the beginning that showed Ukrainian nationalists like committing pogroms, which was a thing that was verified by many people in the early Soviet era, that right after the beginning of the revolution. And to my utter surprise, I did not have critical feedback from people in Ukraine. Maybe because the people that would have given some kind of criticism about it were not reading it or did not read it, but there was actually a lot of interest from both on the Russian and Ukrainian side of an interest in presenting a history of the Soviet Union that was not black and white. So that I found to be especially, I was very glad about that because I was worried that people from the former Soviet Union would look at the book and think, oh, it's too polarizing, or you're not presenting history properly. But actually, it seemed like because this was one person's perspective, it really was just, I did not try to verify my great-grandmother's account. Everything she wrote, I assumed she thought was, her truth, like the truth that she remembered. So I made a decision not to actually verify anything that she said, because also she didn't allow anyone to read it while she was alive. So it was really, there was no reason for her to lie. So I was worried that there would be kind of like negative feedback, but actually it seemed like there was really a hunger in Ukraine, especially for an especially from a generation that was maybe adult and older. I don't really know what young people who had only grown up in post, Soviet collapse Ukraine would think about it. But I know that at least from, the perspective of I went to Dnipropetrovsk, which features a little bit in the book to try to like show the book to other people. And at least kind of like cultural workers and things like that. And from their perspectives, there was actually very positive feedback, because I think you don't usually see that kind of more ambiguous and ambivalent account of Soviet life. It's either things were terrible or things were wonderful, but actually was a fusion, depending on what you're looking at. There were things that were wonderful and things that were horrific. And that doesn't mean that's not something to think about and look at. So the Ukrainian nationalist side, I did not get any objection to, but I did get objection to the moment with the Chechens, that because I purposefully didn't try to verify any of her text, because for me, what was important to realize and understand is that everything she wrote, she thought was accurate. However, the things that were, official policies from the Soviet Union sent to victims in the during World War II probably were not always accurate and probably were not always true. So historians from the United States were actually the ones who emailed me sometimes and were like, I don't think this was actually Chechens. I think this was something that it's more likely that they were native Ukrainians. It's more likely they were the people that were from that particular country. And to them, I said, you're probably right, but the official document sent to my great-grandmother said that the Chechens had murdered her family. So I guess it's a very complex question, because it depends on what you consider true or not true. Because for my great-grandmother, that was the truth, and what I was more interested in crafting the book was, what were her truths? What were the truths that she died believing, about her country and her life? And maybe in 10, 15 years, I can do an expanded version of the book where I can annotate it with a lot of the historical information around it. That would be really fun. But I really was focusing more on what her experience was than on what the official, especially because, as we all know, history changes every year, and the official doctrine will change, a decade to another decade, and who knows, we might find out that a totally different group of people murdered her family. But what won't change is her experience of it, so what won't change is the fact that she died believing this. And so that was why I kept that part in there. But I didn't get any negative feedback from people who were of those communities. It was more like historians in the US that were like, is this accurate? No. I say, I don't care. That's not what this is about. It's not a historical account. It's a personal account. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I would just like to hear a little more about, you said your great-grandmother was a communist. How did you see that in her notes in some way? And I mean, what she was writing about, and was it something that she was writing about at a special time in her life, or yeah, you said she was a secretary in this NKVD, and yeah, just curious, interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. She was really a believer in the Soviet project. So what you see in the book, so I write about this in the book, is that when the Soviet Union was about to fall, she did not want to leave the USSR. And in fact, it took a lot of work for my family to convince her to leave with them, because she had this idea of even if things are failing and even if things are wrong, that it is our duty as Soviet citizens to try to work and make it better. So she was extremely optimistic, actually. She was much more optimistic than I was. The first draft I had of the book, I had a whole chapter where I kind of compared our two personalities, and I'm just such a pessimist, and she was such an optimist about how, what governments were and could be doing, whereas I tend not to believe anything will work out. But she, the section I read, she wanted to be in the Komsomol. She joined the Communist Party as soon as possible. She also came from a very poor family, so I think it was a little bit of a different situation where if she had come from more money, then the kind of it would have obviously been more difficult for her during the Bolshevik Revolution. But really, she saw how much more ability and possibility she had in the world after the revolution, and used every opportunity to join things that were connected to communism. So like the section I read where she joined like her local club, where she like workers union, where she did all of these like theatrical productions, and she really tied a certain amount of freedom to communist governments, so that's not something that I think, at least in America, where at least in the United States, we're taught, we are from a very young age told that communism is oppression. But actually what she experienced was communism as art and culture and access to resources, and, the pre-communist life as being extremely impoverished and full of disease and hunger, so you have this difference in how she experienced the communist life, and also because she experienced it during an era where it was actually quite free for a short amount of time, she had this optimism that it could come back. Can it be that again? That this is possible, and that never really changed. And so when she started writing her like secret memoirs after she emigrated to the U.S., so after 1992. Mostly because I think she was really missing Eastern Europe, and she really had a difficult time in the first few years. She couldn't adjust. She didn't know English. Actually, none of my family knew English, but very few people knew any English at all. But she just was trying to work through her past and also to keep her memories alive. So it's really amazing how much she wrote. In fact, I only actually used about 10%. Like she wrote, my grandmother and I typed it out because she hand wrote everything, obviously. And when we typed it out in Russian, it was something like 70 single-spaced pages in Cyrillic. So it's like, if it were English, it would be like 200, double-spaced pages. So she wrote so much. She was just trying to keep her memory, I think, and actually, she kept her memory her whole life. When she was 98, 99, she was basically just as normal as she was when she was 80 in the 70s. So maybe that actually did do an incredible amount in keeping her her mind really active. But it was just this project that she had, and most of what she wrote was about her very early period. So she was especially focused on the 1920s, 1930s, and early 1940s. And some people approached me asking, why the book goes through between 1945 and 1988 in one chapter. It's so fast. And I say, it's not that, not that I'm doing it on purpose, but she really didn't care. She barely wrote anything after 1945 because she was so much more interested in what was happening in her youth, and even in her in her memoirs. That last part was like very, very, very fast, and there was so much detail about the 1920s and 1930s, just an incredible amount of detail that I didn't put in because it would be like, this cousin ended up liking this girl, and then he married her, and it's like, who cares, It was more about her family, kind of intrigue that was not really relevant to most people, or very dramatic. Yeah, so she had this amazing memory of what it was like in the 1920s. So despite all the trauma, and there was a lot of trauma, she still had these wonderful memories of when she was able to do all of the things that she wanted to do for the first time. So yeah, I guess it just has something to do with her personality, but she didn't talk about politics a lot in the United States, but she just talked about herself as a a Soviet person, you know, versus a Russian or something like that. So I found that to be very, yeah, very inspiring, I guess, when I was young.
Yes, and just another short question. What was she doing during the war? Where was she, and what was she doing? Did she write about that as well? Yeah.
She did. The war is a big part of the book. I don't want to give away too much because then you might not want to read it. But no, she during the war she was a volunteer nurse, but she was evacuated with her 2 children to Uzbekistan, as were actually many other people in my family who were not on that side. So a lot of Jews were evacuated. Either they tended to perish in places like Baba Yar, or they were evacuated to far Soviet, countries. And so she spent several years in Uzbekistan, where she also continued working for, that era's version of the Secret Service, and doing a lot of communication work, which is most of what she did. And then she would do that during the day, and at night she would be a volunteer nurse. Her 3 of her brothers joined. All of her brothers joined the Red Army and were fighting for the Soviet Union. And all of the other, basically, 90% of her family died during World War II. But the interesting thing about her family, and I always emphasize this, especially when I do presentations to like Jewish community centers and synagogues, is actually her family, outside of the fact of her parents, her family fought Nazis. Like, this was a very different type of narrative than you normally see in the United States with regard to Jews during World War II, where usually it's, the Holocaust and gas chambers and Auschwitz, which is obviously the truth. But also another truth was the, millions and millions of people who are Jews that fought against the Nazis in World War II on the side of the Soviet Union. So that I like to emphasize, because it's a really important thing for Jews from the Soviet Union as a kind of source of pride, like the fact of participating in the war effort very intensely. But she was also, while she was like a volunteer nurse, she was also like a lieutenant. So it was this funny thing where, everyone was somehow, if they're in the Communist Party, you're in the Red Army. And so she, even though she wasn't like fighting in the war, she was doing the communique for the Soviet Union in Uzbekistan. But that whole wartime period is very fun, is not the right word, but it was certainly fun to draw, but it's very dramatic, so there's a lot more than I didn't say about what was happening there. It's a very, very dramatic story. So yeah, I hope you check it out if you're interested.
Thank you. Sounds very interesting. Okay, so any more questions before we, or comments, final comments, or should we finish now? It's just about time to finish, actually. Anyway.
Yeah, and I also want to thank Claudia in the chat. I really appreciate the comment there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe it's time to finish then. I would like to thank you both very much. I'm very glad that you could participate, Julian, and I will certainly try to find your book and read it, because there seems to be a lot of interesting things. And it's also very interesting contribution to hear about the sort of history of the Soviet woman.
Yeah,
and
thank you so much.
And thank you, Michael. Very interesting to hear your. I will certainly look again. Since we recorded, we can check all the pictures you were showing, because it was very quick. But I will certainly go through it afterwards. And maybe I will email you if there is something I would like to know. So thank you and take care. And I hope we can still be in touch, maybe follow up on your current work as well. Thank you, Julia.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I hope to be able to come to Sweden after this whole coronavirus thing.
Yes, it
That
would be
great.
nice.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your questions and comments. And yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, Michael. And yeah, if you're interested in getting the book, the publisher ships everywhere and it's very cheap. So
Okay.
all right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye-bye.
Bye.